Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, as you might have guessed, I'm going to be taking a look at Heimdall to see how he does in PvE and PvP with his newest uniform. I covered Hela's rework yesterday in that video, so if you haven't seen that and you're wondering how she is now, make sure to check that out. But in this one, it's going to be all about Heimdall, and for good reason, because he has been in an awful spot for a very long time. I've been hearing some grumblings that Heimdall isn't really worth it with his newest uniform and isn't that great, and that really comes up to you if you want to upgrade the character or get the uniform, but from the testing that I did, I found that he was actually pretty good and meets the standards for a modern character. Besides that, his new uniform looks amazing, so if you don't get it for how it performs, then you'll definitely like how it looks. Just as a preface, and not really to sully the character's performance, not every character is going to be game breaking or meta. As long as they're good, they serve some function in the game. For Heimdall, he likely won't topple any of the characters in the top spots for PvP and PvE, so things like Timeline and World Boss Legend or ABX or anything like that, but he is a very good character and strong throughout, and does have pretty good performances in PvP, so he'll likely be useful in Alliance Conquest, and at the very least, he'll likely be in a lot of the story mode chapters, so you can benefit from having his uniform there. If that's not reason enough to get the uniform or the character upgraded, that's totally fine. Just check out the testing and decide for yourself. As always, these are what my card stats look like. I always show them because it's important for you to get an idea of how the character performs, so you can gauge them relative to your own account. Similar to Hela's testing yesterday, the first thing I did when I got access to Heimdall's uniform is to take him into Timeline to see his potential in PvP. The build that I tested with had an obelisk with guard break immunity, some dodge on it, and 4 seconds of invincible. Besides that, since I had some selectors from Black Friday, I decided to use them and get his 5-star artifact, which I have to say makes a big difference in PvP, so keep that in mind when you watch the performance of the character in the timeline tests. Also, the reason that I mentioned that it makes a big difference is because he doesn't have a heal in his kit without the artifact. And considering that he's very durable with his iframes and his guaranteed dodge, as well as the 4th skill, which has immunity to all damage that constantly refreshes in that little bubble that he spawns, the healing makes a big difference since he can stay alive long enough with the artifact, but without it, he'll eventually just have his health bar dwindle away and end up dying from that. But as you can see, his base kit is pretty solid and his AI rotation is pretty great as well. He constantly spams the 4th skill, which has pretty good priority and will activate fairly quickly, and then he rotates usually between his 5th skill, which does a lot of damage, and he gets the buff up from the 4 and 5, so at that point he has a lot of potential damage available to him, and then he can go into his 3, which is a lingering skill, and the 5 is lingering damage as well, which basically ends up stacking up damage on the opponent while he stays invulnerable in that bubble shield on his 4th skill. If the opponent hasn't died from that, he frequently ends up going into his awakening skill, as you probably noticed in the clip in the background. He is pretty susceptible to reflect damage though, so you have to watch out for that because his 3, 4, and 5 do a lot of it. Also, look how cool he looks with his newest uniform. It's so damn good. Anyways, the hit count for his skills is 4 hits for the 1st skill, 10 hits for the 2nd skill, which actually does a lot of base damage. 3rd skill can be cancelled, but does up to 16 hits if you let it play through. 4th skill does up to 31 hits and a little bit more if you let it play through, but ideally you want to cancel the skill. The 5th skill can also be cancelled and does up to 37 hits, but you don't want to cancel it till after he's swiped the sword down and then raised it back up into the air. So one more time to show you what it looks like, he'll raise the sword up to the air, strike it down, and then raise it up one more time where a giant spear appears. That's when you can cancel. If you cancel before that spear drop, you will lose a ton of damage from the skill. The awakening skill, similar to Sif's and Valkyrie's, can be cancelled after the colored lines appear, and does 47 hits, one more than the other characters because he has that little sword attack at the end. In terms of the highlights to his kit, His tier 2 passive gives him 40% guaranteed dodge, which is really noticeable and good in PvP. And that's not all, he also gets up to 40% decreased damage from all sources, and the standard skill damage increase and bonus damage increase. You might be thinking that with the decreased damage received being as high as 40%, and the fact that he is a universal with no weaknesses to any other types, that a reforged authority with the steal effect might be really good for him, and that's likely the case. But during my testing, I found out that there's likely a more optimal CTP for him in PvP. And I'll show you that in a little bit, but that doesn't take away from the fact that a Mighty Authority with the steal effect is a very solid choice for him. Moving on, his third skill might not look like much, but it does provide some really useful buffs in PvP, including that guard hit, which is nice, and it also has the incapacitation effect, which removes active buffs, and the really important 3 seconds of silence. You might be thinking that the effects that I just listed are kind of whatever, there are better ones in the game, but the cooldown on this skill is 13 seconds, which with full cooldown of 50% goes down to roughly 7 seconds. So almost half of the time he's activating that silence and guard hit and incapacitation. The fourth skill is where the effects start to pick up a little bit. He gets that frenzy buff that gives him 35% increased damage, as well as 25% increase to defenses and some speed increase. You can see that he also gets 100% chance for immunity to all damage, but you might think that that's not great because it only says that it lasts for 1 second, but in fact that's a reapplying effect. So if you stay in the bubble that he spawns when he opens the Bifrost, you end up being immune to damage for a total of 8 full seconds, which, if you looked at the cooldown, is listed at 18 seconds, and with 50% cooldown reduction, that goes down to 9 seconds. So 1 second is the amount of time that you are not immune to all damage. So you can basically be immune to all damage almost all the time, meaning that if the opponent doesn't use a penetration skill or the buff effect for a penetration skill has ended, then they're not going to damage Heimdall. Then the fifth skill is where everything goes crazy. He gets stun, 80% chance for the opponent to miss the attack on top of that guaranteed dodge and that immunity shield. He also gets the paralysis effect to apply to the opponent, which makes it even harder for them to deal damage to him. And he also becomes invincible for 3 seconds, and if that wasn't enough, he also gets 40% increase to attack and defenses, as well as increases to speed and crit rate. I'd also like to highlight that the paralysis effect that ignores immunity applies for 3 full seconds, and if you know how quick the PvP fights go, 3 seconds is a lot of time to be locked down. His tier 1 passive then gives him 15% dodge rate, which synergizes very well with his tier 2 passive that gives him that 40% guaranteed dodge. And then very suitingly, he gets 40% chance to ignore the opponent's dodge rate, which makes sense since he can see across the realms, and he's immune to the blind effect for the same reason. His leadership then pushes the ignore dodge value even higher to 70% total, giving him 30 more if you combo it with his tier 1 passive. And you might be thinking, why would you use him in the leadership position just for that? Well, if you look at his uniform passive, you can see that he will get a debuff removal, which means that you can easily use his leadership in content like PvP and also get that added defense bonus for the character himself. And if you decide to use him in PvE content or possibly even dispatch, then you get a pretty good advantage there, since more of that higher level content requires ignore dodge now because the opponent is at a higher level compared to yours. As I previously stated, he gets that awesome self debuff removal with his uniform passive, which has only 2 seconds of downtime, meaning that you can use a double support for him in PvP content like Alliance Conquest. Besides this, offensively he also gets 30% increase of physical attack and 15% increase of chain hit damage, so that 4 and 5 that linger on and do a lot of ticking damage combo really well with the chain hit damage, and that 30% physical attack makes it so that he does some pretty good burst damage. And that artifact that I spoke about earlier being so useful and basically pivotal in PvP, is one that gives him healing or health back when he drops under a certain health threshold, which in addition also gives him increased damage versus supervillain factions. You can see that for my 5-star artifact, I get 50% health back when I drop under 50% health. Every rank or star of the artifact that you go up, you increase by 10% of that. So a 6-star artifact will have 60% of your health return when you drop under 60% of your health. So for most people, if you get lucky to even get his artifact around 3 or 4-star, you're looking at about 30% health back when you drop under 30% health, or 40 and 40. The damage on the artifact, on the other hand, increments by 2%. But like I mentioned earlier, if you want to get the most value out of him in PvP, you're going to need at least a 3 or 4-star version of this artifact on the character. It basically becomes a deciding factor of whether he might go into his awakening skill in auto content in PvP, or if he has enough survival to warrant using alternative builds for his kit. Looking at the PvE performance for him, I took him into stage 60 of World Boss Ultimate Thanos, where he didn't have a damage proc, so I'm only using that custom gear that I mentioned earlier, which has the guard break immunity and the 4 seconds of invincible. Also, considering that I had the character already transcended for story mode, for this first test I'm not using the awakening skill, just to show you how much of a difference the clear time makes with and without the awakening skill used. If you're wondering what the skill rotation is for the character, if you're using a single skill damage proc, you likely want to use the 4 and insta cancel into the 5th skill. That's mostly what you're going to use when you don't have the character awakened. After you finish proccing on the 5th skill, you can incorporate the 3rd skill for a little bit more damage, as well as the 2 and 1, and then go back into the 4 cancel 5 when your proc is back up. So you can go with a CTP of energy or even something like a destruction if you want to go more hybrid and use this rotation. But because you can't insta-cancel the awakening skill and the 3rd skill does have some lingering damage or takes a little bit before you get that final hit, if you want to maximize his damage in specifically PvE content, I would think that the Rage would likely be your best choice for that, especially considering that Valkyrie has the same awakening and has been often used with the CTP of Rage in content like AVX. Anyways, with no proc and no awakening skill used, I finish with 2 minutes and 8 seconds remaining. Then, with the awakening skill being used, I finish with 2 minutes and 34 seconds remaining, which is 26 seconds faster than before. When you're using a single skill damage proc like a CTP of energy or a destruction, the way that the rotation changes when you have the awakening skill unlocked or available to use is that you do 5 insta-cancel, 4 insta-cancel, and go into your awakening skill, which is the one that you want to proc on. You want to do the 5th skill first to get the buff from that, but cancel it so no damage is done to activate the proc. Then you go into the 4th and cancel that as fast as you can, since that has very quick damage that it does, so you want to do it second to get the buff from that, and have both buffs active when you proc on the awakening skill. You can see that you do lose out on using the 5th skill, which is why I said if you go with something like a CTP of Rage, or possibly even a CTP of Greed if you want him hybrid for PvP in that sense, then the rotation for that kind of build is 4 insta-cancel into your 6, you delay cancel that after the colored lines appear, go into your 5th, and you delay cancel that after he puts his sword back up in the sky and the spear appears, and then you stay in your 3rd skill, and use your 1 and 2 when everything else is on cooldown. Once everything else is off cooldown, then you go back into the rotation that I mentioned previously. I wasn't expecting anything too crazy out of him in PvE content, but he did do pretty decently since I was able to clear a stage 14 with a leadership and a support, and no damage proc with roughly 30 seconds remaining. Because I already tested Heimdall out with an invincible obelisk in PvP, I wanted to see how something like a destruction with the damage proc would fare, so because I equipped that on him, I decided to see how much of an improvement a damage proc build would make versus null stage 14. By the way, the reason that I mentioned earlier that I wasn't expecting too much from him in PvE content was because he doesn't have that characteristic damage accumulation that makes characters really good for that kind of content. But that's perfectly okay, since not every character can and should have damage accumulation. The fact that he has 2 damage buffs makes it so that he has 75% damage increase to all his skills for the majority of the time, and you don't have to worry about dealing or taking damage to get that pretty sizable damage increase to all of your skills. With just a regular destruction, no reforged options, I finish 1 minute and 10 seconds faster, which means that if I had the reforged option for the increased boss damage, I could probably finish about 1 minute faster than that. And if I use something like a CTP of energy, I could finish even further faster than that, especially if I had a reforged version of that energy. But if I went with a CTP of rage, I would likely experience the best improvement, somewhere in the range of 2 minutes I would guess, better than when I had the obelisk. Going back to the same Thanos test on stage 60, my clear time improved by an additional 43 seconds compared to when I just used the obelisk and was using the awakening skill as well. So with the destruction equipped, I finished with 3 minutes and 17 seconds remaining. Similar to Hela in the last video, after I finished testing the characters in PvE, I refined their build to see how much of an improvement it would make in PvP. So I ended up getting to rank 3 for Heimdall, and because Asgardian characters are my favorite, then it was well worth it for me. But the tests that I do this time around are with the CTP of Destruction, whereas the tests in the beginning of the video were with a custom gear with Invincible. So you can get an idea of how the character performs with either kind of build, a defensive or survival based build, and an offensive based build. Though I will say that I did have much more success with a CTP of Destruction, since he wasn't really dropping to that half health point mark too often for me, so that extra penetration and the damage proc let me take out characters that took him a lot of time to clear or that he outright couldn't. An example of that being Dr. Doom. Now I wouldn't advocate using Heimdall against him, especially in timeline, but my testing is just to show you what he possibly can do. He isn't super consistent against Doom since he's tough to hit, because Heimdall doesn't have iframe ignore, but he can occasionally take him down. For this first test, I'm taking Heimdall up against my own team, so that's Sentry with a brilliant regen with penetration, and Doom with a brilliant authority with the steal effect. The team that I'm using to fight my brilliant team, quote unquote, isn't even the best one that I can use to counter them, since I'm using Victorious just for the extra health as opposed to someone like Colossus for the extra defense, or a character like Taskmaster or Mystique for the extra offense. As you can see in the clip though, even if my damage proc is up and I miss it on a skill, the penetration that I get from it and the lingering damage from the 5th and 4th skill let me go through the opponent's Invincible. For consistency's sake, here is the same fight again, but this time I'm using that better support, being Colossus instead of Victorious. Also, if you noticed in the last fight, and you'll probably notice in this fight as well, my artifact did activate, and I wouldn't be able to win these fights without that artifact proc. You can notice that his survival is pretty good even with no Invincible or regen shield. And the fact that he constantly spams that damage immunity shield from the 4th skill means that I can make a destruction work, and he can benefit from that penetration and one-shot really strong characters like Doom. Another important thing to note is that I am surviving long enough to go into that awakening skill, even by having this damage proc, which is really important since when he goes into that awakening skill with the damage proc and the penetration, it's basically an insta-kill to whichever opponent he's facing. So here is another team that's a top 3 challenger team, in case you were skeptical about the team that I was using. It's important to note that at least one of Doom's lives have been taken out by Heimdall's awakening skill. Since he doesn't have an iframe ignore, that's likely going to be the case, so that's one reason why he's not necessarily the best versus characters like Doom. The opponent Heimdall here in the 2nd spot has a brilliant authority with that steal effect. The fact that I can take him out with regular destruction should give you a bit of an idea of just how well it synergizes with Heimdall's kit. Now, I'm not advocating that you do build him with a CTP of destruction, I'm just showcasing the results that I had with that build. A CTP of authority, especially with that steal effect, is still a very solid choice for him and would make him very difficult to take down. A regen could also be okay since he does have a decent health pool, and because he usually stays around the same health mark, around the 50%-ish range, he can have that shield and healing activate almost frequently. Keeping that in mind, you could also opt for something like a CTP of Greed, which is a little bit of a mix between the regen and the destruction. So you lose out on the penetration, which isn't so great, but you get a little bit of healing from the Greed, as well as that damage proc from the Greed as well. And if you're able to reforge it with the ambush effect, because he does stay alive and take hits, you can do a lot of damage since he'll ignore that damage mitigation when that proc activates. And he'll also get that super guard break immunity. You can see he doesn't have any trouble with most of the characters in the game, but reflect characters do pose some issue. If you want to know how to play the character on manual, you try to move around a little bit, at least till you can get your skills up. Then you immediately want to go into your 4th skill, so you have that damage immune bubble up. Then go into your 5th skill, so you do a lot of damage, and you get that 2nd buff up for damage and defense. After that, you can use your 3rd skill and stay in that to get the silence application and do damage from that. And from there, your skills will be back up, so you can rotate into the 4 and 5 again. Try to save your awakening skill for characters that iframe a lot or are tough to take down, and for characters like Doom, you can activate the 4th skill when he activates his 5th skill, and you should be safe in that bubble for a good period of time till he comes back out of his 5th iframe. Then you can immediately go back into your 4 or 5 to finish him off. Finally, to get an idea of how the character might perform in a 3 vs 3 format, since Alliance Conquest isn't up, I took him into the Master of Shadowland. It's not exactly how he'll perform since he immediately goes into his Awakening skill, but you can get an idea of his ability to survive with a damage proc versus a meta character that has 2 lives, like Mephisto. Granted, I am using 2 supports against the character, but because of his self-debuff removal, I'm more than capable of doing that. So if you wanted my advice on how to build Heimdall, if you want him for PvE, then you go with Rage. If you want him for PvP, but you want him to be tanky and tough to take down, then you can use a CTP of Authority, especially with that strike effect. If you want the best of both worlds or want him offensive, then I think a CTP of Destruction has a little bit of an edge versus Greed, since that penetration makes a pretty significant difference in PvP. But using a CTP of Greed with that added health proc every so often is actually pretty nice, so you can get a balance between being offensive and having a little bit of extra survival. So there's no clear-cut CTP that I would recommend. It just depends on what you want from the character and how you would want them to play. I'm very happy with the CTP of Destruction build that I currently have, though I'll have to test him a little bit in Alliance Conquest to see how that holds up in a 3 vs 3 setting. Considering how useless Heimdall was before, I'm actually pretty happy with the changes that he got, and I hope that more people give him a chance and try him out. The next video that I'm going to be working on is Sif, so I'll show you how she does compared to Valkyrie, and if the video doesn't get too long, I might include the changes to Thena in that one as well. Anyways, that is the video. If you found the information useful or the video entertaining, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Or if you know someone that might enjoy the video, then please consider sharing it to them as well. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section down below and I'll do my best to get back to you. You can also consider joining the Discord channel since I can answer questions there, and there's other like-minded people that you can talk to or they can help you out as well. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.